The words flowed like silk through the empty hallway. French, Mandarin, Arabic, each language perfect, each syllable crisp, spoken by a man the world had taught to be invisible. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The words flowed like silk through the empty hallway. French, Mandarin, Arabic, each language perfect, each syllable crisp, spoken by a man the world had taught to be invisible. But that revelation was still hours away. At 5:47 a.m., the 42nd floor of Meridian Industries hummed with the quiet efficiency of a man who had perfected the art of being unseen. Miguel Santos pushed his cart through the executive wing, his movements deliberate and respectful, avoiding the family photos and awards that lined the mahogany desks. 23 years of cleaning had taught him the geography of other people's success. He paused at the corner office, its brass nameplate reading Jonathan Pierce, CEO. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, dawn painted the city in shades of gold and shadow. Miguel had watched 1,000 sunrises from this window, always wondering what it felt like to own the view instead of just cleaning around it. The office was pristine, as always. Jonathan Pierce was the kind of man who left no trace of humanity in his workspace, no coffee rings, no scattered papers, no evidence that dreams and doubts lived here alongside quarterly reports. Miguel dusted the imposing desk, careful not to disturb the perfectly arranged documents. A photograph caught his eye. Jonathan with his late father, both in expensive suits, both wearing the same distant smile. What would it be like, Miguel thought, to have your worth measured in stock prices instead of how well you emptied trash cans? He finished quickly and moved on, leaving the office as immaculate as he'd found it. 3 hours later, Jonathan Pierce stepped out of his private elevator, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble floors still damp from Miguel's careful mopping. At 45, Jonathan commanded Meridian Industries with the same precision his father had, turning the family construction business into a multinational empire. But success, he'd learned, was a beautiful prison. His assistant Rebecca fell into step beside him. The Shanghai team needs to finalize the hotel project specs. The Paris office has questions about environmental compliance, and the Berlin partners want to discuss the acquisition timeline. Jonathan nodded, his mind already compartmentalizing the day's battles. Schedule the calls. Shanghai first, then Berlin, then Paris, and make sure legal reviews the compliance issues before I speak to anyone. Of course, sir. The morning blurred past in a familiar rhythm of conference calls and strategic decisions. Jonathan spoke to executives across 3 continents, his voice carrying the authority that moved millions of dollars with a few well-chosen words. Yet something felt hollow about it all. The same conversations, the same power plays, the same isolation that success had built around him like a glass tower. By noon, the building pulsed with corporate energy. Employees hurried through hallways, their conversations a mix of industry jargon and careful ambition. In this ecosystem, everyone knew their place: executives on the upper floors, middle management in the middle, support staff below, hierarchy, predictability. Miguel worked through lunch. Invisible as always, he'd perfected the art of cleaning around meetings, his presence so unnoticed that executives discussed million-dollar deals as if he were a piece of furniture. Sometimes he caught fragments of their conversations, merger talks, international expansions, regulatory challenges, and found himself understanding the implications better than they might expect. But understanding and belonging were different things entirely. As the afternoon wore on, Miguel found himself thinking about his evening class at the community center. 3 nights a week, he taught basic Spanish to immigrants, watching their faces light up when they mastered a difficult phrase. It was the only time he felt truly seen, truly valued for what lived in his mind, rather than what he could clean with his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who spoke 12 languages fluently, who once lectured on comparative linguistics at the University of Madrid, now spent his days emptying the wastebaskets of monolingual executives who earned more in a month than he made in a year. But pride doesn't pay rent, he reminded himself, as he had every day for the past 2 decades. Meanwhile, Jonathan sat in his glass office, staring at reports that all said the same thing: Meridian Industries was thriving, revenue up 18%, international expansion ahead of schedule, stock prices climbing steadily. By every metric that mattered, he was succeeding beyond his father's wildest dreams. So why did he feel so empty? The loneliness of leadership had always been sold to him as a noble burden. Heavy lies the crown, his father used to say, but lately, Jonathan wondered if the weight came not from responsibility, but from the distant success created between him and everyone else. When had he last had a conversation that wasn't about profit margins or strategic positioning? When had someone last looked at him and seen Jonathan the person, not Jonathan the CEO? His phone buzzed. Rebecca's voice came through the intercom. "Sir, the Berlin team is ready for your call. Put them through." And so the day continued, each call blending into the next, each decision reinforcing the walls that kept him isolated at the top of his tower. Below him, 41 floors down, Miguel Santos continued his quiet work, carrying secrets that would have stunned anyone who bothered to look. Neither man knew that in just a few hours, their carefully constructed worlds would collide in a way that would change everything. The sun was setting, painting Jonathan's office windows in shades of amber, when the first crack appeared in the wall between their two lives. What assumptions do we make about people based on their job titles? Share your thoughts below. Have you ever discovered someone had hidden talents that surprised you? The call came at 7:23 p.m., just as Miguel was finishing the 38th floor. Jonathan's voice echoed through the empty hallway, sharp with frustration. "What do you mean they don't speak English? This is a $20 million contract." Miguel paused, his hand on the handle of his cleaning cart. The CEO's office door stood slightly ajar, spilling light into the darkened corridor. Through the gap he could see Jonathan pacing behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his usually composed demeanor cracking. "Rebecca left hours ago," Jonathan continued, his voice rising. "I need someone who speaks Mandarin, and I need them now. The Shanghai team is threatening to pull out if we can't resolve this tonight." Miguel knew he should keep walking. 23 years of invisible work had taught him the unspoken rules: see nothing, hear nothing, exist in the spaces between other people's important moments. But something in Jonathan's voice, a note of genuine desperation beneath the executive authority, made him hesitate. The phone slammed down. Through the crack in the door, Miguel watched Jonathan slump into his chair, running his hands through his silver-streaked hair. For a moment the CEO looked less like a corporate titan and more like a man drowning in his own success. Miguel's cart squeaked softly as he moved closer. He could leave, should leave, clock out and go home to his small apartment, grade papers for his evening students, pretend he hadn't witnessed this moment of vulnerability. Instead, he knocked. "Come in." Jonathan's voice was weary, defeated. Miguel pushed open the door, his dark hands steady on the cart's handle despite his racing heart. Jonathan looked up, and for the first time in 2 decades of working in this building, the CEO actually saw him, really saw him. Miguel stood in the doorway, a tall, dignified black man in his late 50s, whose weathered face carried the quiet intelligence of someone who had lived multiple lives. "Sir," Miguel said, his voice soft but clear, "I couldn't help but overhear. You need someone who speaks Mandarin?" Jonathan blinked, confusion replacing frustration. Yes, but I don't think." "May I?" Miguel gestured toward the phone. Something in his tone, calm and confident, made Jonathan nod before his rational mind could object. Miguel approached the desk with the same careful dignity he brought to everything, but now Jonathan noticed what he'd missed for years. This wasn't the posture of someone broken by circumstance, but someone who had chosen humility over bitterness. Miguel lifted the phone and dialed the Shanghai number from memory. He'd overheard it enough times during his cleaning. The line connected, and suddenly the empty office filled with fluid, perfect Mandarin. "We nin hao, wo shi Miguel Santos, wo dai biao Meridian Industries gongsi." Jonathan's mouth fell open. The words flowed like water, each syllable crisp and natural. This wasn't textbook language. This was the Mandarin of someone who understood not just the words, but the culture behind them. Miguel spoke for several minutes, his tone shifting subtly as he navigated what Jonathan recognized as complex negotiation territory. At one point Miguel even laughed, a warm, genuine sound that somehow conveyed respect and familiarity simultaneously. Finally, Miguel hung up and turned to face Jonathan, whose world had just shifted on its axis. "The contract terms are acceptable to them," Miguel said quietly. "They were concerned about the environmental impact assessments, but I explained our commitment to sustainable practices. They'll send the signed documents tomorrow morning." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Jonathan stared at this man he'd passed in hallways for years without truly seeing, this man who had just solved a problem that had consumed his entire evening. "How did you—" Jonathan's voice trailed off. "No Mandarin?" Miguel's smile was gentle, patient. "I speak 12 languages, sir. Mandarin is actually one of my weaker ones." 12 languages. Jonathan repeated the words as if they were foreign themselves. Miguel nodded, then seemed to catch himself. The mask of invisibility started to slip back into place. "I should finish my rounds, sir. I didn't mean to overstep." "Wait." The word came out sharper than Jonathan intended. Miguel stopped, his hand on the cart handle. "I'm sorry, Miguel, isn't it?" Surprise flickered across Miguel's features. In 23 years, the CEO had never used his name. "Yes, sir. Miguel Santos." "Miguel." Jonathan stood, moving around his desk. Up close, he could see the intelligence in Miguel's eyes, the dignity in his bearing that had nothing to do with job titles or corner offices. "How is it possible that you speak 12 languages?" For a moment, Miguel's carefully constructed walls wavered. Jonathan caught a glimpse of something deeper, pride, pain, and a lifetime of stories compressed into silence. "Languages have always come naturally to me, sir. I find that words, they build bridges between people." "But where did you learn?" Jonathan stopped himself. The question felt invasive, presumptuous, but Miguel seemed to read his genuine curiosity. "I taught comparative linguistics for 15 years, Miguel said quietly. "At universities in Madrid, then briefly at Columbia before." He gestured vaguely, the motion encompassing whatever circumstances had led him here, to this moment, cleaning offices instead of filling them. The weight of those words settled between them. Jonathan felt something crack open in his chest, not pity but recognition. Here was a man whose mind could navigate cultures and languages like Jonathan navigated boardrooms, yet he spent his days emptying trash cans and mopping floors. "Miguel," Jonathan said, his voice softer now, "would you mind staying a few more minutes? I have calls to Berlin and Paris, and something tells me you might be able to help with those too." Miguel's eyes widened slightly. For the first time in years, someone was asking for his mind, not just his hands. "I'd be honored, sir." As Miguel moved away from his cleaning cart and toward the conference table, both men felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. The invisible walls that had separated them for decades were beginning to crack, and neither would ever be quite the same. The phone rang again, Berlin calling back. Jonathan looked at Miguel and nodded. This time Miguel's voice filled the office with perfect German, and Jonathan began to understand that he'd been working beside a miracle all along. The next morning arrived like a cold slap of reality. Miguel stood in the supply closet at 5:30 a.m., staring at his reflection in the small mirror he'd hung behind the cleaning supplies. The face looking back at him was the same one that had spoken fluent German to Berlin executives just 10 hours ago, but in the harsh fluorescent light, surrounded by mops and disinfectant, last night felt like a dream. "What were you thinking?" The voice in his head sounded like his ex-wife Carmen, whose disappointed sighs had followed him through their final years together. "Playing professor again? Haven't you learned your lesson?" He pulled on his uniform shirt, the polyester fabric rough against his skin. This was real. This was safe. The languages, the knowledge, the part of him that had once commanded lecture halls, that was the dangerous part. That was the part that had cost him everything before. Miguel had learned to be invisible for good reason. Visibility meant expectations. Expectations meant the possibility of failure, and failure for a man like him wasn't just professional, it was devastating. Meanwhile, 41 floors above, Jonathan Pierce sat in his home office, nursing his third cup of coffee and staring at his laptop screen. The Shanghai contract sat in his inbox, signed and delivered exactly as Miguel had promised. The Berlin deal had moved forward. The Paris environmental concerns had been addressed with a cultural sensitivity that had impressed even their most demanding partners. All because of a janitor. No, Jonathan corrected himself. Not a janitor. A man with a PhD who happened to work as a janitor. But that correction felt dangerous, like admitting he'd been fundamentally wrong about something he'd never consciously thought about. If Miguel could be brilliant and invisible simultaneously, what did that say about everyone else Jonathan had overlooked? What did that say about the system he'd inherited and perpetuated? His phone buzzed, Rebecca's morning text, calendar reminder, board meeting at 9 a.m., Q3 review. Also, facilities manager wants to discuss staffing issues. Jonathan's thumb hovered over the reply button. He could ask about Miguel, could inquire about his background, his story, his credentials. But something held him back, a fear that last night had been an anomaly, a fluke that would crumble under scrutiny. Better to let it rest. Better to pretend it had been a one-time favor and return to the natural order of things. By 7 a.m., Meridian Industries hummed with its usual morning energy. Executives strode through lobbies, assistants juggled schedules, and the complex hierarchy that kept everything functioning fell into its familiar patterns. Miguel moved through it all like a ghost, his cartwheels whisper quiet on marble floors. But today, the invisibility felt different, heavier. Every executive who passed him without acknowledgement felt like a small betrayal of what had happened the night before. "Miguel!" He turned, surprised. Rebecca stood near the elevator bank, her tablet clutched against her chest. She looked nervous, apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, glancing around as if checking for witnesses, "but Mr. Pierce asked me to find you. The Tokyo office is having some kind of communication breakdown, and he wondered if you might." She trailed off, uncertainty clouding her features. Miguel felt his chest tighten. Here it was, the expectation he'd feared. Last night had been an emergency, a moment outside normal reality, but this felt like the beginning of something he wasn't sure he was ready for. "Of course," he heard himself say. "I'll be right up." The elevator ride felt eternal. Each floor that passed reminded him of the distance he was traveling, not just physically, but socially, professionally, emotionally. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Miguel hesitated. This morning, the hallway looked different, more intimidating. The mahogany and marble spoke of a world he'd once belonged to, but had learned to stay away from. Jonathan's office door was open, but Miguel knocked anyway. "Come in." Jonathan looked up from his computer, and for a split second, Miguel saw something flicker across his face, relief mixed with uncertainty. "Miguel, thank you for coming up." The politeness felt forced, artificial. Last night's easy collaboration had been replaced by the awkward distance of daylight reality. Rebecca said you needed help with Tokyo? Yes, well, Jonathan gestured vaguely at his computer screen. There seems to be some confusion about the project specifications, cultural nuances, you know. I thought perhaps he was asking but not asking, requesting help while maintaining plausible deniability. Miguel recognized the dance, the way people sought his expertise while ensuring they could deny they'd needed it. I understand, Miguel said quietly. Would you like me to make the call? Jonathan nodded, but something in his posture had changed. He was the CEO again, fully armored in authority, and Miguel was the janitor who happened to be useful. The vulnerability of the previous evening had been carefully locked away. Miguel handled the Tokyo situation with the same skill he'd shown the night before, switching effortlessly between English and Japanese, navigating cultural sensitivities that would have taken the average negotiator hours to understand. But this time, Jonathan watched him with analytical distance, as if trying to understand a machine rather than connecting with a person. When the call ended, silence filled the office. "That was very helpful," Jonathan said formally. "Thank you." Miguel nodded, recognizing the dismissal. "Of course, sir, I should get back to my rounds." As he reached the door, Jonathan called out, "Miguel?" He turned back, hope flickering despite his better judgment. "Perhaps we should keep this arrangement informal, you understand." Miguel understood perfectly. "Don't tell anyone. Don't make this public. Don't disturb the natural order of things." "Of course, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the familiar sting of being asked to hide his light under a bushel. Walking back to his cart, Miguel felt the weight of 2 decades pressing down on him. He'd allowed himself to hope, just for a moment, that things might be different, but hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment led to the kind of pain that could destroy a man. Better to stay invisible. Better to stay safe. 41 floors below, both men returned to their separate worlds, each carrying the memory of what had been possible and the fear of what might be lost if they reached for it again. Have you ever felt torn between playing it safe and taking a chance that could change your life? What held you back, and what would you do differently now? The power outage hit at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, plunging half of Manhattan into darkness. Miguel was finishing his final rounds when the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting the 42nd floor in an eerie red glow. He'd been here during blackouts before. The building's backup generators would restore partial power within minutes. But tonight was different. His radio crackled to life. "All maintenance staff, we've got a major grid failure. Primary generators are down. Backup power to emergency systems only. Nobody leaves the building until we get the all clear from the fire department." Miguel sighed and settled in for what would likely be a long night. At least he had his small flashlight and, "Miguel? Is that you?" The voice came from behind him, strained and unfamiliar. Miguel turned to see Jonathan Pierce emerging from the stairwell, his usually pristine appearance disheveled. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and there was something almost vulnerable about seeing the CEO without his usual armor of artificial lighting and executive presence. "Mr. Pierce," Miguel approached cautiously. "I thought you'd gone home hours ago." "I was in the parking garage when the elevators died." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. "Climbed 42 floors. Haven't done that since, well, ever." He paused, breathing heavily. "Security said we're stuck here until they can verify the building's structural integrity." The red emergency lighting cast strange shadows across Jonathan's face, making him look older, more human somehow. Miguel had never seen him outside the controlled environment of his executive suite. "The backup power should restore soon," Miguel offered. "There's a break room on this floor with some chairs." "Actually," Jonathan interrupted, then stopped himself. Miguel could see him wrestling with something. "I was wondering, the international markets are in chaos right now, because of this outage. I've got partners in Sydney, Singapore, Hong Kong, they're all trying to reach me. My phone's dying, the landlines are down. You need someone who can speak to them, Miguel finished quietly. Would you mind? The question came out humble, almost embarrassed. I know it's not exactly your job description. Miguel studied Jonathan's face in the red-tinged darkness. This wasn't the commanding executive making demands. This was a man genuinely asking for help. Something about the vulnerability in his voice, the way the power outage had stripped away their usual pretenses, made Miguel nod. Of course. They made their way to Jonathan's office by flashlight, their footsteps echoing strangely in the empty building. Without the usual hum of electricity, the space felt different, smaller, more intimate. Jonathan's massive desk, so imposing under normal circumstances, looked like just furniture in the wavering light. I've got a satellite phone in my emergency kit, Jonathan said, fumbling through a drawer. Battery-powered, should work even with the towers down. As he searched, Miguel found himself looking around the office with new eyes. In the darkness, the photographs on Jonathan's desk were just shapes, the awards just shadows. Strip away the trappings of power, and this was just a room where a man worked. Here, Jonathan handed him the satellite phone, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Singapore first. They're probably panicking. Miguel dialed from memory and spoke in fluent Mandarin, then Cantonese, then English, depending on who answered. Jonathan listened, fascinated despite himself, as Miguel navigated complex financial terminology in multiple languages, his voice calm and authoritative. The Singapore team is securing their positions, Miguel reported after the first call. They're actually in a good position to capitalize on the chaos if we can coordinate properly. You understand international finance? Jonathan asked, unable to hide his amazement. Miguel's smile was barely visible in the darkness. I taught economics before linguistics. Markets are just another language, the grammar of human greed and fear. For the next 2 hours, they worked together in the strange intimacy of the darkened office. Miguel fielded calls across Asia-Pacific markets, while Jonathan provided strategic guidance. But something shifted between them during those hours. The formal distance of their usual interactions dissolved in the darkness. How do you do it? Jonathan asked during a brief lull between calls. They sat across from each other at the conference table, sharing a bottle of water Jonathan had found in his emergency kit. Do what? Stay so dignified. 23 years in this building, cleaning up after people who probably never even learned your last name, and you never seem bitter, never seem angry. Miguel was quiet for a long moment. In the red emergency lighting, his expression was thoughtful, distant. Anger is a luxury I can't afford, he said finally. Bitterness poisons the person who carries it more than the people it's aimed at. I learned that the hard way. What happened? The question slipped out before Jonathan could stop it. I mean, how does someone with your abilities end up cleaning your office? Miguel's voice held no resentment, just weary acceptance. Life happens, Mr. Pierce. Sometimes the world decides your worth for you, and fighting it only breaks you further. The satellite phone rang again, Hong Kong calling back with complications. As Miguel switched effortlessly into Cantonese, Jonathan found himself studying this man he'd worked alongside for decades without truly seeing. In the strange democracy of darkness, with the normal hierarchies suspended, Miguel seemed less like an employee and more like an equal. By 2 a.m. they'd managed to stabilize most of the Asian markets. The immediate crisis was contained, but the power was still out, and they were still trapped together in the red-lit cocoon of the office. Thank you, Jonathan said quietly. I couldn't have handled this without you. Miguel nodded, but something in his posture suggested he was already preparing to retreat back into invisibility once the lights came back on. Mr. Pierce? Miguel's voice was hesitant. When morning comes, when everything goes back to normal, what happens then? The question hung in the darkness between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to face. Outside, the city slowly flickered back to life, and both men knew their strange interlude was nearly over. The power came back at 4:17 a.m. with a sudden flood of fluorescent brightness that made both men squint and blink. In an instant, the intimate darkness was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of the executive office. Miguel stood quickly, as if the light had reminded him of his place, and began gathering the empty water bottles and papers scattered across the conference table. "Leave those," Jonathan said softly, but Miguel was already moving, his invisible armor sliding back into place. "I should get back to my rounds, sir. Thank you for letting me help." "Miguel, wait." But Miguel was already at the door, his cart waiting in the hallway, like a faithful reminder of who he was supposed to be. Jonathan watched him go, feeling something precious slip away with the morning light. 3 days passed in careful avoidance. Miguel returned to his ghost-like routine, and Jonathan threw himself into work with unusual intensity. But the memory of their collaboration lingered, refusing to be filed away with other business emergencies. On Sunday evening, Jonathan found himself walking through Central Park, seeking clarity in the autumn air. He'd always made his best decisions alone, away from the pressures of the office. But tonight his thoughts kept returning to the same questions: who was Miguel Santos, really? And why did it matter so much? The answer came unexpectedly, in the form of a small flyer taped to a park bench: English as a Second Language Free Classes Community Center on 94th Street, Instructor Professor M. Santos. Professor. Jonathan stared at the flyer, until the words blurred. Then, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite name, he found himself walking north toward the address. The community center was a modest building wedged between a laundromat and a bodega. Through a window on the second floor, Jonathan could see into a brightly lit classroom, and there at the front of the room was Miguel. But this wasn't the Miguel who cleaned offices in polyester uniforms. This Miguel wore slacks and a button-down shirt. His posture was straighter, his gestures more animated. He moved around the classroom with natural authority, writing Spanish phrases on a whiteboard, while a dozen adult students, immigrants by the look of them, hung on his every word. Jonathan found himself climbing the stairs, drawn by curiosity and something deeper he couldn't name. He paused outside the classroom door, listening. The subjunctive mood, Miguel was explaining in accented but perfect English, expresses doubt, emotion, desire. In Spanish we say ojalá que tengas suerte, may you have luck. The tengas is subjunctive because luck is uncertain, hoped for but not guaranteed. An elderly woman raised her hand. Professor Santos, is like when I say I hope my son calls me. Exactly, Mrs. Rodriguez, espero que me llame. The alarm is subjunctive, because you can't control whether he calls, you can only hope. Miguel's eyes met Jonathan's through the doorway, and for a moment the careful mask slipped. Surprise, then something like panic, flickered across his features. "Class," Miguel said, never breaking eye contact with Jonathan, "please practice the exercises on page 47, I'll be right back." He stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind him. In the dim fluorescent light, he looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way Jonathan had never seen. "Mr. Pierce," Miguel said quietly, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Professor Santos," Jonathan replied, emphasizing the title, "neither did I." Miguel winced. "It's just a community college certificate program, nothing formal." "Don't." The word came out sharper than Jonathan intended. "Don't diminish what you're doing in there. Those people look at you like you're giving them the world. It's just English grammar." "It's hope," Jonathan said firmly. "It's dignity. It's the difference between surviving and belonging." Miguel's shoulders sagged slightly. "Mr. Pierce, what do you want from me?" The question hit Jonathan like a physical blow. What did he want? To understand? To assuage his own guilt? To make sense of a world where brilliant men cleaned toilets while mediocre ones sat in corner offices. "I want to know who you are," Jonathan said finally. "The real story, not the careful version you think I want to hear." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Jonathan's face as if trying to determine whether this was curiosity or cruelty. 15 years ago, Miguel said finally, "I was Dr. Miguel Santos, professor of comparative linguistics at Columbia University. I had tenure track, published papers, spoke at international conferences. I was somebody." He paused, looking through the classroom window at his students. "I came here from Madrid in 1995 on a fellowship. Brilliant career ahead of me. Then my wife got sick, cancer, the medical bills, even with insurance, we lost everything. Our house, our savings. My focus, my research suffered. Publications stopped. When Carmen died 3 years later, I was broken, financially, emotionally, academically." Jonathan felt something tight and painful in his chest. The university was understanding, but understanding doesn't pay bills or restore a reputation. "I had gaps in my CV, no recent publications, debts that followed me everywhere. Academic positions require references, networks, the appearance of success. I had none of that." "So you became invisible," Miguel finished. "It was temporary at first, just until I could rebuild, but temporary became permanent. 20 years passed, like 20 minutes, and after a while you realize that invisible is safe. Invisible doesn't get your heart broken again." The hallway was silent except for the murmur of students working behind the closed door. "But you kept teaching," Jonathan observed. Miguel's smile was sad but genuine. "I couldn't stop completely. This," he gestured toward the classroom, "is the only place I still feel like myself. 3 nights a week I remember what it felt like to matter." "You matter at Meridian too," Jonathan said quietly. "More than you know." Miguel's laugh was hollow. "I empty trash cans, Mr. Pierce. Let's not pretend otherwise. You saved a $20 million contract, you prevented an international crisis, you speak 12 languages and understand global markets better than most of my executives. And in the morning, I'll still be the janitor who you can't acknowledge in front of your colleagues." The truth of it hung between them like a challenge. Jonathan wanted to deny it, but they both knew Miguel was right. The corporate world had rules, hierarchies, expectations. Disrupting them would require more courage than Jonathan was sure he possessed. From inside the classroom came the sound of laughter, Miguel's students discovering the joy of linguistic connection. Both men turned toward the sound. "They see me," Miguel said softly. "In there I exist." Jonathan looked at this brilliant, dignified man who had been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. "Then maybe," Jonathan said quietly, "it's time the rest of us opened our eyes." The next morning Jonathan did something unprecedented. He arrived at the office at 5:30 a.m. Miguel looked up from his cart in genuine shock as the CEO stepped off the elevator onto the 42nd floor. Jonathan carried 2 cups of coffee and wore jeans instead of his usual suit, a small rebellion that somehow felt monumental. "Good morning, Miguel," Jonathan said, offering one of the cups. "I thought you might like some company." Miguel accepted the coffee cautiously, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. "Sir, you don't need to." "Jonathan," the CEO corrected gently. "And yes, I do need to. May I walk with you while you work?" For the next hour, something extraordinary happened. As Miguel moved through his routine, dusting, vacuuming, emptying trash, Jonathan walked beside him, and they talked. Really talked. Not the careful dance of employer and employee, but the genuine exchange of 2 people discovering each other. My father built this company with his hands, Jonathan said, watching Miguel carefully clean a conference room window, started as a construction foreman, worked 18-hour days, saved every penny. By the time I was old enough to understand, he owned half the buildings in Midtown. You must be proud of him, Miguel said, spraying glass cleaner with practiced efficiency. I am, but I also think he forgot something important along the way. Jonathan paused. He used to tell me that the measure of a man was what he built, but he never talked about how he treated the people who helped him build it. Miguel glanced at him sideways. And what do you think the measure of a man is? Jonathan considered this as they moved to the next office. I'm starting to think it's how he sees people, really sees them. That's a dangerous way of thinking for a CEO, Miguel said with a small smile. You might actually have to change things. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. As the morning progressed, their conversation deepened. Miguel shared stories from his teaching days, the brilliant students who overcame language barriers to succeed, the cultural nuances that made translation an art rather than a science. Jonathan found himself laughing at Miguel's impressions of different accents, amazed at how the same words could carry entirely different meanings depending on inflection and cultural context. Language is like music, Miguel explained as he organized supplies in a storage closet. The words are just notes. The real meaning comes from the spaces between them, the rhythm, the emotion behind the sound. Is that why you're so good at the international calls? You hear more than just the words? Exactly. When the Shanghai team was upset about the environmental assessments, it wasn't really about the paperwork. They were afraid of losing face if the project failed. Once I understood their real concern, the solution became obvious. Jonathan shook his head in wonder. I've been in business for 20 years, and I never would have picked up on that. Different kinds of intelligence, Miguel said diplomatically. You understand power structures, market forces, strategic thinking. I understand people. We make a good team, Jonathan said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Miguel's hands stilled on the supply inventory he'd been updating. Mr. Pierce, Jonathan, you know this can't last, right? When the real world starts up in a few hours, when your executives arrive, when the board members need their meetings, I'll go back to being invisible. That's how it has to be. Jonathan set down his coffee cup and turned to face Miguel fully. What if it doesn't have to be that way? What are you suggesting? I don't know yet, Jonathan admitted. But Miguel, you've been wasted here. Your mind, your abilities, keeping them locked up in a janitorial closet is like using a Stradivarius as kindling. Miguel's laugh was bitter. Pretty metaphors don't change reality. The world sees a middle-aged black man with a 20-year gap in his academic career. No recent publications, no current connections in linguistics, no credible references who remember Professor Santos. I'm unemployable in my field. But you're not unemployable in mine. The statement hit Miguel like a physical force. He turned to stare at Jonathan, searching his face for signs of pity or condescension. Instead, he found something that looked like genuine respect. You don't mean that? I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Miguel, you solved more international crises in one night than some of my executives handle in a year. You understand cultural nuances that could save us millions in failed negotiations. You think strategically, you communicate brilliantly, and you have a presence that commands respect. Miguel shook his head. Jonathan, you're talking about turning the corporate world upside down, promoting the janitor to executive level. The board would see results, Jonathan interrupted. That's all they care about. Results and profit margins. You can deliver both. For a moment, Miguel allowed himself to imagine it. A real office, not a supply closet. Meetings where his mind mattered more than his mop. A nameplate on a door that said Dr. Miguel Santos instead of hearing "Hey you" in hallways. But the dream felt too fragile to touch. People don't change that much, Jonathan. Your world has rules, expectations. A black janitor becoming an executive overnight? That's not how stories like mine end. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of Miguel's words and the systemic barriers they represented. Maybe, Jonathan said finally, it's time to write a different kind of story. The early morning light was starting to filter through the windows, painting the empty offices in shades of gold. In a few hours the building would fill with people and noise, and the complex machinery of corporate life. But for now, in this quiet space they'd created together, anything felt possible. Miguel looked at Jonathan, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't expected, a man willing to risk his own comfort to do what was right. If you're serious about this, Miguel said slowly, if you really want to try something different, what would be the first step? Jonathan's smile was answer enough. When was the last time someone truly saw your potential and believed in you? Share a moment when recognition changed your life. We'd love to hear your story in the comments. The first sign of trouble came at 10:47 a.m., 3 weeks after Jonathan had quietly moved Miguel into a small office on the 39th floor with the title International Cultural Liaison. Richard Blackwood, chairman of the board and Jonathan's father's oldest friend, stood in the doorway of Jonathan's office with a face like thunder. Behind him lurked Margaret Chen, the head of HR, clutching a tablet and looking deeply uncomfortable. "We need to talk," Richard said, closing the door with deliberate force. "Now." Jonathan looked up from the Shanghai quarterly reports Miguel had helped him interpret that morning. The numbers were extraordinary. Their Asian partnerships had flourished under Miguel's cultural guidance, with profit margins up 37% in just 3 weeks. "Good morning to you too, Richard," Jonathan said carefully. "What's this about?" "You know exactly what this is about." Richard dropped into the chair across from Jonathan's desk without invitation. The janitor, Jonathan. The goddamn janitor, sitting in an executive office. The words hit the air like a slap. Margaret shifted uncomfortably by the door, her loyalty clearly torn between two powerful men. "His name is Miguel Santos," Jonathan said evenly, "and he's transformed our international relations in ways you can't imagine. I don't care if he's the reincarnation of Henry Kissinger." Richard's voice rose. "You promoted a maintenance worker to executive level without board approval, without HR review, without even a background check." "Actually," Margaret interjected quietly, "I did run a background check at Mr. Pierce's request. Dr. Santos has a PhD in comparative linguistics from Universidad Complutense Madrid, with additional degrees in economics and international relations. His academic record is impeccable." Richard waved her words away like annoying flies. "That was 20 years ago. The man's been pushing a mop cart for 2 decades. "Because he had to," Jonathan said, his voice hardening, "because the system failed him when his wife was dying, because men like us were too blind to see what was right in front of us." "Men like us?" Richard's laugh was harsh. "Jonathan, I've known you since you were 12 years old. Your father and I built this company on certain principles. Principles like keeping people in their place?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Richard's face flushed red, and Margaret looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "This isn't about keeping anyone anywhere," Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is about corporate governance. This is about chain of command. This is about not making decisions that could destroy everything your father worked to build. Or maybe," Jonathan said, standing slowly, "this is about the fact that Miguel is black." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret actually gasped. Richard's face went from red to white and back to red again. "How dare you?" Richard whispered. "How dare you suggest that this company, would promote him if he looked like me?" Jonathan finished. "Tell me, Richard, if Miguel Santos had been a white professor who'd fallen on hard times, would we be having this conversation?" Richard stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward. "I won't be lectured about prejudice by someone who's clearly lost his goddamn mind." Margaret, what's the legal exposure here? Margaret looked miserable. There could be complications. Other employees might file complaints about promotion protocols being bypassed. Union representatives have already made inquiries, and if this becomes public, it won't become public, Richard said firmly, because it's ending today. He turned back to Jonathan. You have two choices. Move your pet project back to the janitor's closet where he belongs, or I'll call an emergency board meeting and have you removed as CEO. The threat landed like a physical blow. Jonathan felt his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. You can't be serious. Dead serious. I've already spoken to 3 other board members. They're as concerned as I am about your judgment lately. Promoting maintenance staff, bypassing HR protocols, making unilateral decisions that affect company policy. It paints a picture, Jonathan. A picture of a CEO who's lost touch with reality. Jonathan's phone buzzed. A text from Miguel. Tokyo deal finalized. They're signing tomorrow morning. Your cultural approach worked perfectly. He showed the screen to Richard. This man just secured a $50 million contract that we've been chasing for 6 months. I don't care if he secured the Hope Diamond, Richard snapped. He's a liability, a PR nightmare waiting to happen. Can you imagine the headlines? CEO promotes janitor, desperate stunt or mental breakdown. Maybe the headline should be company finally recognizes talent regardless of job title. Jonathan shot back. Richard's smile was cold. Always the idealist, just like your father warned me you'd be. He worried you were too soft for this business. The words hit their target. Jonathan felt something break inside his chest, the last connection to the approval he'd spent his life seeking. Get out, Jonathan said quietly. I'll give you until 5 o'clock to make your decision, Richard continued, as if Jonathan hadn't spoken. Santos goes back to maintenance, or you go back to whatever liberal fantasy world spawned this insanity. The door slammed behind him, leaving Jonathan alone with Margaret, who looked like she'd witnessed a car accident. Sir, she said quietly, for what it's worth, Dr. Santos has been nothing but professional. The international teams speak very highly of him. Jonathan nodded absently, staring out his window at the city below. Somewhere down there Miguel was probably having lunch, unaware that their fragile partnership was crumbling around them. 20 minutes later, Jonathan found himself standing outside Miguel's small office. Through the glass partition, he could see Miguel on a conference call, switching effortlessly between languages, his face animated with the passion of someone finally using his gifts. Miguel looked up and smiled, gesturing for Jonathan to come in, but Jonathan just stood there, frozen by the weight of Richard's ultimatum and the terrible mathematics of corporate power. He turned and walked away without entering, leaving Miguel staring after him with growing confusion and dread. The war between his conscience and his survival had begun, and Jonathan wasn't sure which side would win. At 4:32 p.m., Miguel knocked on Jonathan's office door. He'd been watching the clock all day, sensing something wrong in the building's atmosphere. Conversations stopped when he passed. Executives who had begun acknowledging him with respectful nods now looked away. Margaret from HR had avoided eye contact completely. But it was Jonathan's absence that truly frightened him. For 3 weeks, they developed a rhythm: morning coffee, afternoon strategy sessions, the easy partnership of minds that complemented each other. Today, nothing, just a cold silence that felt like abandonment. Come in. Jonathan's voice was hollow, defeated. Miguel entered to find Jonathan standing at his window, staring out at the city with his back turned. His shoulders were rigid with tension, his reflection in the glass showing a man aged by impossible choices. Jonathan, Miguel's voice was gentle, careful. We missed our 4 o'clock meeting about the European expansion. Sit down, Miguel. Jonathan didn't turn around. Please. The formality of it, the careful distance, made Miguel's stomach clench. He'd heard this tone before, 20 years ago, when department chairs and deans had delivered careful speeches about budget cuts and difficult decisions. "You're sending me back," Miguel said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jonathan's reflection closed its eyes. "Richard Blackwood came to see me this morning, with Margaret. They're concerned about my recent decisions." "I see." Miguel folded his hands in his lap, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. "And you're concerned about your position. It's not that simple, isn't it?" Miguel stood, his dignity intact even as his world crumbled again. A black janitor in an executive role was always going to be temporary, wasn't it? A nice experiment until the real world reasserted itself. "Damn it, Miguel." "That's not." Jonathan spun around, his face etched with pain. "You think this is easy for me? You think I want to do this?" "What I think," Miguel said, his voice gaining strength, "is that I should have known better. 20 years of invisibility should have taught me that men like you don't really change. You just feel guilty enough to play dress-up for a few weeks." The words hit Jonathan like physical blows. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Miguel's laugh was bitter. "Fair would have been recognizing my abilities 20 years ago when I first applied for jobs. Fair would have been seeing past my circumstances to my potential. Fair would have been not letting me waste 2 decades of my life, because your world is more comfortable when people like me stay in our assigned places." Jonathan moved toward his desk, his hands shaking as he picked up a folder. "I've arranged for you to keep your current salary. Same pay grade, but you'd return to your previous position. It's the best I can do." "The best you can do?" Miguel repeated the words like they tasted bitter. "Do you know what I was working on when your friend Blackwood decided I was too dangerous to exist? The Mumbai expansion. They want to build 3 hotels in markets where we've failed twice because nobody understood the cultural dynamics. I was solving that. Me, the janitor." Jonathan's voice was barely a whisper. "I know. The Tokyo contract that I closed this morning? That was going to fund your father's scholarship program for underprivileged students. I read the projections, $50 million that could change lives. But I suppose that's less important than maintaining your board's comfort level." Each word was a carefully aimed arrow, hitting every vulnerability Jonathan had revealed during their conversations. Miguel had learned him well during their brief partnership, and now he was using that knowledge like a weapon. "Miguel, please understand, if I fight this, they'll remove me as CEO. Everything I've worked for, everything my father built. Everything your father built on the backs of people he never bothered to see as human?" Miguel's voice rose, years of suppressed anger finally breaking through. "Tell me, Jonathan, what do you think he would say about this choice? About sacrificing integrity for stock prices?" Jonathan sank into his chair, looking older than his 45 years. "He'd say I was being naive. That business isn't about fairness, it's about results." "And what do you say?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of a friendship that had been real however brief. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "I say I'm a coward." Miguel felt his anger deflate, replaced by something worse, pity. "Yes," he said softly, "you are." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You know what the saddest part is, Jonathan? For 3 weeks I remembered what it felt like to matter, to use my mind instead of just my hands, to be seen as a person instead of a function. You gave me that gift, and then you took it away." "Miguel." "No." Miguel held up a hand. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just tired. Tired of hoping that things will change. Tired of believing that men like you have the courage to do what's right when it costs them something." He opened the door, then looked back one last time. "I'll be in my old office tomorrow morning. But Jonathan, don't expect me to be grateful for the consolation prize, and don't expect me to pretend this conversation never happened." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Jonathan alone with the weight of his choice. Outside, Miguel walked slowly to the elevator, his head held high despite the devastation in his heart. He'd survived worse losses than this. He would survive this too. But as the elevator descended 41 floors, taking him back to the world of mops and invisibility, Miguel allowed himself one moment of grief for what might have been. In his office, Jonathan sat in the growing darkness, staring at the folder that contained Miguel's reassignment papers. At 4:59 p.m. his phone buzzed. A text from Richard Blackwood, "Smart choice, see you at the board meeting tomorrow." Jonathan looked at the message for a long time, then very slowly, he deleted it without responding. The choice was made. Now he had to live with the consequences. Miguel arrived at 5:30 a.m. on Friday morning, just as he had for the past 23 years. His cleaning cart waited in the supply closet like an old friend, and his polyester uniform hung on its familiar hook. But as he dressed, something felt different. The man putting on this uniform wasn't the same one who had worn it 3 weeks ago. He pushed his cart through the familiar hallways, but this time he noticed things he'd never seen before. The way the morning light hit the marble floors he'd mopped thousands of times, the sound his cart wheels made on surfaces he'd cleaned until they gleamed, the weight of keys that opened doors to rooms where he'd been invisible for decades. At exactly 6 a.m., as he reached the 39th floor, Miguel heard something that made him stop. Applause. He turned the corner to find them waiting, Sophia from accounting, who spoke broken English and had thanked him tearfully when he'd helped her with immigration paperwork, James from IT, who'd mentioned Miguel's tech troubleshooting skills to his supervisor, Maria from reception, who'd watched Miguel patiently teach her elderly mother basic English during lunch breaks. Dozens of employees, arriving early, lining the hallway. As Miguel appeared with his cart, they began to clap. "Professor Santos," Sophia called out, her voice carrying down the corridor, "thank you for helping my family." "Thank you for seeing us," added James. One by one, employees stepped forward, people Miguel had helped in small ways over the years, offering translations, solving problems, sharing knowledge during coffee breaks and elevator rides. People who had always seen him, even when the executives above couldn't. Miguel stood frozen, his hands gripping the cart handle, overwhelmed by this recognition from the people who mattered most, not the ones with corner offices, but the ones who did the real work of keeping the company alive. Then he heard heavier footsteps and looked up to see Jonathan Pierce walking toward him, carrying a briefcase and wearing the most determined expression Miguel had ever seen on his face. The applauding employees stepped back, creating a clear path between the two men. The silence that followed was electric with possibility. "Miguel," Jonathan said, his voice carrying clearly through the corridor, "I need to speak with you. I believe you said everything necessary yesterday, Mr. Pierce." "No," Jonathan said firmly. "I said everything I thought I had to say. Now I need to say what I should have said." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, not the reassignment papers, but something else entirely. 20 years ago you applied for a position with our international development team. Margaret found your original application in the archives. Jonathan held up the papers, PhD in comparative linguistics, Masters in international economics, publications in 4 academic journals, fluent in 12 languages, references from Columbia University calling you brilliant and irreplaceable. Miguel's breathing became shallow. "Jonathan, what are you doing? What I should have done 20 years ago. What this company should have done." Jonathan's voice grew stronger, more confident. "Dr. Miguel Santos, I'm offering you the position of Vice President of International Relations, effective immediately." A gasp went through the assembled crowd. Miguel felt his knees weaken. "The board can go to hell," Jonathan said, and several employees actually laughed. "I called an emergency meeting this morning at 5 a.m. Before Richard could mobilize his opposition, I presented them with something he couldn't argue against: results. Jonathan pulled out another set of papers. The Shanghai contract you negotiated, 50 million in revenue. The Tokyo expansion you secured, projected 75 million over 3 years. The Mumbai project you solved, potential market value of $200 million. Miguel stared at the numbers, hardly believing what he was hearing. I told them, Jonathan continued, that promoting you wasn't charity or political correctness or a mental breakdown on my part. It was the best business decision this company could make, and if they couldn't see that, they were too blind to lead a modern corporation. And they agreed? Miguel's voice was barely a whisper. Jonathan's smile was radiant. They voted unanimously to approve your promotion. Even Richard, once he saw the projected revenues. Turns out greed is colorblind. The hallway erupted in cheers and applause. Sophia was crying. James was grinning. Even the security guards at the elevator had big smiles on their faces. But Miguel wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Jonathan, seeing something in the man's face that hadn't been there before. Peace. The peace that comes from choosing courage over comfort. Why? Miguel asked, his voice thick with emotion. Why risk everything for me? Jonathan stepped closer, speaking quietly enough that only Miguel could hear. Because 3 weeks ago you taught me what it means to really see people, and once you see someone, really see them, you can't unsee them, you can't go back to pretending they don't matter. He paused, then added with a smile, besides, my father always said the measure of a company isn't what it builds, but who it builds up. Miguel looked down at his cleaning cart, then back at Jonathan. What about this? Keep it if you want, Jonathan said. Consider it a reminder of where you've been and how far you've come. But Miguel, Dr. Santos, your office is waiting on the 42nd floor, right next to mine. For a moment, Miguel couldn't speak. 20 years of invisibility, of being overlooked and undervalued, of cleaning up other people's messes while his own brilliance gathered dust, all of it led to this moment. I accept, he said finally, his voice strong and clear. The crowd erupted again. Jonathan extended his hand, and when Miguel shook it, it felt like the beginning of something unprecedented, a partnership built on mutual respect rather than corporate hierarchy. As they walked together toward the elevator, Miguel noticed that his cart remained in the hallway. For the first time in 23 years, he was walking through Meridian Industries without it. You know, Miguel said as they stepped into the elevator, Vice President is a pretty impressive title. You've earned it, Jonathan replied. 20 years overdue, but earned? The elevator rose through the floors, carrying them both toward a future neither had imagined possible just 24 hours earlier. And somewhere in the building below, Miguel's abandoned cart sat quietly in the hallway, a symbol of the past, finally left behind. Outside the windows, the sun painted the city in shades of gold and possibility, and two men who had found friendship across the barriers of class and race rode together toward the top of the world. Sometimes the most powerful changes happen when we find the courage to see people as they truly are, rather than as their circumstances might suggest. When have you been surprised by someone's hidden talents or potential? Share your stories of unexpected recognition and second chances below. Your experience might inspire someone else to look beyond the surface.
If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching the story to the end.